open to creating, it self-regulates itself around this, and it's brought in a lot more measures in the last sort of 12 months. But it didn't probably help Facebook's cause that its CEO didn't turn up to the select committee. That seems to have really annoyed them. They had something like 73 people turn up and have a chat, but Mark Zuckerberg wasn't one of them.
What do you make of whether this is just sort of finger wagging rather than something that's going to result in something solid?
It's another indication of how things are changing, especially around sort of, the countries around the OECD. And so we saw earlier in the week the tax coming out through, our own government talking about taxing these big companies, these big platforms, and obviously in the back of the OECD looking into it. It's happening in France, Australia, Germany. Everybody is looking at these platforms now. Every government is saying, okay, you kind of had a Wild West going. You had it really good. What is the impact on our democracies? What is the impact on our revenue streams? We need to have a look at this. We need to get you find out how we can all work together better. And so one country alone probably not going to happen. But as you're seeing more and more countries around the world coming together and thinking about how they can, well, let's face it, regulate these big platforms. So I think they probably see that time is very close to them, very, very near.
Thank you very much, Sarah Putt, technology commentator. Very soon, Sir Michael Cullen will be with us to talk about what the tax working group has decided and how it's going to affect you. But we'll go a little early to Tamar Munch now with what she's been viewing. Tamar, good morning. Can
Hello.
you hear me? Good morning.
Yes.
Good morning.
Hello.
Hey, let's begin with, that was a little bit of Aunt Daisy for you there. A very English scandal. I've been watching and enjoying this. What have you made of it?
Yeah, well, it's, this is a 1970s, I guess. That's when it's set. But given the current state of English politics, it's kind of interesting in the scheme of things to watch everything implode and then be watching this. So a very English scandal. It's a 3-part BBC miniseries. It starts off in 1960s England, early 1960s, at a time when homosexuality was illegal. And Hugh Grant plays politician Jeremy Thorpe, who begins a whirlwind affair with a young stable hand, Norman Scott, who's played by Ben Whishaw. So those are the two leads, Hugh Grant and Ben Whishaw. And during their affair, Jeremy Thorpe wrote lots of letters to Norman, and Norman kept those letters, which ultimately that contributes to Thorpe's downfall. The series shifts from the early 60s through to the late 70s. Episode 2 aired. It plays on Wednesdays, so that's just gone to air, but there are catch-up versions and things like that. So I don't want to give too much away for people that might be following it.
It's extraordinary, though, isn't it, that this is based on a true story? But don't you think also it's a wonderful performance by Hugh Grant, who has had he's played so many sort of, how can I put it?
Foppish kind of.
Yes. Very predictable types of characters. This tests him as an actor. And what did you make of the performance?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I mean, he was nominated for a Golden Globe for that performance, and as was Ben Whishaw, who actually won the supporting actor role. But I think that it's a shame for Hugh Grant that he didn't win in the end, because we do actually see a lot more emotional range from him than we're used to. You really get to see his range as an actor and his ability as an actor. I mean, potentially worth noting, Stephen Frears is the director of the series, so they've got some great experience behind them.
Now, we might just quickly touch on fresh eggs, because we're going to be a little short with you today. I'm sorry, yes. Tamar. Fresh eggs. We spoke to one of the actors on Friday, the esteemed cast. Here it's an extraordinary cast of some of our top actors. What did you make of the premiere last night?
So that was the last Tuesday night was the first of 6 parts, and this is a black comedy. It's about an Auckland couple who are leaving the city for greener pastures in the country, but it's about as far from the good life as you can imagine. It is there's nothing kind of rural idle about this series. It is bold and brash, and there is murder and mayhem within the first few minutes of the episode, and that just doesn't abate. They absolutely cram-pack a lot into that first episode. It sort of leaves your head spinning a little bit. But yeah, the cast is terrific. Really nice to see some of our, great talent on screen, and actually some of the newer faces as well. So you've got obviously Claire Chittum and Cohen Holloway as among the leads, as well as Danielle Cormack. But Yosun Ann and Zana Tang both play a young couple who have moved to the country as well. And I really enjoyed. They're quite underplayed in the context of what is quite a heightened series. I really enjoyed their performances as well. And Danielle Cormack's character in episode 1 doesn't really have much of a show. We get a bit of a taste of her, but she definitely comes in much stronger in episode 2 and beyond.
There's some great writing here. There's some real New Zealand humour, and quite a bit of it's un-PC, which is always welcome as well.
Yeah, it is. I mean, it's look, there's a finger and some baked beans, like a severed finger, in the first few minutes of the series, and there was a bit of animal, I don't know that you'd call it animal abuse, but sort of I found a little bit uncomfortable. Some of the stuff around the miniature horse, just in the context of the news story of the day that the episode aired, being around the miniature horse that had been killed terribly. It just sat a bit awkwardly, but that was, I mean, they can't do anything about that, the writers. It was obviously written months ago. But yeah, it's bold, it's brash, it's not subtle in any way, shape or form, I will say that.
Good stuff, and good to see a new Zealand drama. Let's just touch briefly on Dirty John, streaming on Netflix. This is another true crime podcast, right? That's spawned some TV.
Exactly. So it's based on the excellent true crime podcast of the same name. And actually one of the guys who was the reporter of the podcast, he's a crime reporter, and he wrote the series, which is Eric Banner playing the character of the title, John, and Connie Britton, who plays a wealthy interior designer who's been married 4 times. She meets John on a dating site. I mean, this is a true story. It sounds like I'm just riffing about some American trash, but it is a true story, and it's phenomenal. Basically, the guy is handsome and charming, and he's apparently a doctor, and she really falls for all of this, but her daughters are pretty sus about him. I think obviously they've been through 4 marriages that she's had, so they're a little bit wary of her choice in men, and rightfully so. He turns out to be not just a liar and a fraud, but also ultimately really dangerous, and the action of the podcast ramped up. So you sort of met all the characters, and then you really got to the end last episode, and it all just blows up, and as this does with the series. It depends. If you haven't watched the podcast, I think the series is probably quite compelling.
Right.
If you have listened to the podcast, I should say, you sort of know the end, you know where it's going. So the potential, I think for me, the intensity was less because I know the outcome.
Right. Brilliant. Thanks, Tamar.
Yeah.
Dirty John is streaming on Netflix. 29 minutes past 11. You are listening to 9 to Noon on RNZ National.
Coming along. Just to let you know that I'm off to do a speech to the Institute of Public Administration in the banquet hall at midday. I think it's a sellout, by the way, so you can't squeeze in, but we'll need to wrap things up just before midday in order for me to make that. Can I start today by thanking the Tax Working Group for their report? So Michael Cullen and the other members of the group have done a huge job here. Taking on looking at the entire New Zealand tax system is no easy task, and we're very pleased that they have presented their report to us. I want to reiterate the government's process from here. We're taking a measured approach to the report, taking our time to study the recommendations and understand the consequences of them. We will now be working to achieve a consensus among the parties that make up the government, and we will work together among those parties over the coming weeks. We will respond to the report in full in April. If there is legislation or changes to the tax system arising from that, they will be consulted on before any legislation is introduced. If there is legislation, it would be passed this term, but would not come into force until the 2021 tax year, i.e. after the next election. I want to reiterate the commitment that the government made in establishing the tax working group to exclude the family home, not increase tax rates and not introduce an inheritance tax. We believe that this report is a constructive part of looking into the future of a fair and balanced tax system. Mr. Nash.
And just one thing I would say is we need to be aware that the overall findings confirm there is no need for a major overhaul of the system, and our response will preserve the key principles of our existing broad-based low-rate tax system. And in the words of the Prime Minister, we will not throw out the baby with the bathwater.
Questions?
How do you solve the greatest roadblock that appears to be facing you, Winston Peters? How do you solve a problem like Winston?
I think that might be your words, Tova, not ours. I know that Mr. Peters and also New Zealand First and the Green Party are committed to working together with the Labour Party to come up with a position for this government. All of you know it is the reality of MMP that in order to pass legislation, if that's what ends up being the case here, we have to get the votes to do that. That's the process we're working through now, and I can say that the early discussions that I've had with Mr. Peters and New Zealand First is that they are engaging very constructively.
Would you consider just looking at the minority report recommendations around the residential rental properties, just going with that if that got Winston Peters across the line?
Well, you're getting way ahead of yourself. I mean, all of those recommendations are there. I think it's probably worth looking at that the other way round, which is that the entire working group of 11 people have agreed to that proposal that it be extended to residential rental. That's an interesting recommendation and one that we can take a look at, but we're well and truly in early days of looking at the full suite of packages in the report.
At first glance, looking at farming, that may be one of the sticking points when you're trying to negotiate and getting everyone's support. What is your initial take on that?
I don't have a particular initial take on that. As I say, there are a range of packages here, and I think it's really important to understand we set out when we set the group up and asked the group to look at that. So taking one bit out in isolation from another doesn't probably give us the best framework for analysis at this time. We've got principles that we're applying here, which is about how do we create the fairest and most balanced possible tax system, and we'll look at the components of the packages in that light.
You're talking about there are some elements of this which are highly unlikely. You said highly unlikely to take all recommendations, so that must mean that some are highly unlikely to be implemented already. Where are those areas?
No, I just think the point that we're making there is, given the breadth of the recommendations that are here, it is unlikely that all of them will be able to be implemented. I'm not picking out a specific part of that at this point. It's just clear when you've got a report of this nature that covers this much ground, it's unlikely that will happen.
Well, many of the recommendations in the environmental section are contradictory to the coalition agreement or to government policy. Would it be your intention to get any legislation in relating to the taxation of water or the taxation of nitrate inputs in this term of government?
No, and because that's not actually what the group's recommending either. The group's recommending that we look into those issues. When it comes to the question of taxation on water, as you note, Richard, the coalition agreement rules that out. What I think the section on environmental taxation does is provide some interesting insight into the way you might make decisions in the future about those issues. It also raises other issues that are already on the work program of the government, such as looking at the waste levy. But I don't believe that actually the report's saying that would happen this term, and as you're pointing out, the coalition agreement says it won't.
You said the government's due to make its official formal response in April. Is that going to be early April, mid-April, or late April?
We haven't confirmed a date in April.
Is that because you're leaving yourself a little bit more room in case negotiations go sour?
It's because there's 30 days in April.
Do you have confidence that you'll, away from political considerations, that you have the technical capability of the New Zealand government to actually pass this legislation before the election? Is that a guarantee that any legislation will be passed?
Absolutely. You know, we've got an incredibly competent staff in the main revenue. They're working very hard on this, and you know, absolutely we do have the ability to do.
Will we still be a 6-month select committee period, given there's already been this consultation?
There's no intention to change. If there is legislation, there'll be no intention to change the normal select committee
It's not going to be done
process.
through urgency. It's going to go through the proper legislative process if any legislation is required.
On the
Would
farm,
would you use personal income taxation as an election year tax bribe? Tax bribe?
Again, Tova, there's some quite pejorative words in your question there. What I'd say is that these are packages. This would be, whatever we respond to will be to the whole report. And the report quite clearly offers up the option of, if there is increased income coming into the government coffers, ways that can be used, including through personal taxation changes. So that's what we now have to work through. I would characterise us as looking at the report and working out what the best package is to fulfil those principles of the fairest possible tax system.
In the end, you've got to remember that we did ask the tax working group to look at the structure, the fairness and the balance of the tax system, which is what they have done.
On the farm side of things, New Zealand First has expressed kind of interest in carving out exemptions and various other legislation for the rural sector, especially around workplace legislation. Could you see, there's some chatter about this happening with us as well, could you see some kind of exemption being carved out for the rural sector in this tax plan?
That's not something we've got to yet. I'm not ruling anything in or ruling anything out today. What I would say is, again, that there is a package here, or a series of packages that have been put forward, and we have to look at what will help us create the fairest possible tax system and what we can generate consensus around.
Have you had any meetings with Mr. Peters or officials so far on this?
Yes. We've had some preliminary discussions at a political level with Mr. Peters.
Based on this report, or
they've been very, very general at a level of principle, and now we're in a position to be able to work through the details.
How would you characterise those discussions?
Constructive.
So when Winston Peters said yesterday to the country that farmers would not be subject to it, was he right or wrong?
Well, you're going to have to ask Mr. Peters about what his view is on that, but my reading of what I saw there is that he was talking about the very common situation in which farms stay within families and they're not sold.
If you're saying already that you're highly unlikely to adopt all of the recommendations, are you not getting ahead of yourselves?
No, we're just making a general point that the scale of this particular exercise means that getting all of that work done, getting all of that work done and processed in the timelines we've got means that some things won't be there. Mr. Harmon's already pointed out a recommendation that goes against the coalition agreement. We are not going to implement something that goes against the coalition agreement.
A lot of the things that have been recommended by this working group spooked you at the last election. Are you brave enough to actually do anything this time?
I don't get spooked easily, Jenna.
Were you to go for a broad-based capital gains tax, would you go for this one, or could there be some version that you come up with yourselves?
Oh, this is what we're working from as a base, but I think the chair of the working group's been clear. There are options available to the government to take up aspects of this or not, and so we'll use this as the base and have a thorough and wide-ranging discussion.
Both you and Mr. Nash are using the word if, and you're qualifying the possibility that there's going to be legislation. How much of a political fail will it be if you can't get some legislation through the House this term?
Oh, look, we are committed to making sure that we do our best to fulfil the mandate of the group. The group's come back to us and said the tax system by and large works well, but there are gaps, and we will do our very best to come up with a package that meets those gaps. You are all aware that we operate in an MMP environment, and individual parties' positions going into that are what they are. At the end, we have to work towards consensus. It's my belief that all of the parties have a very constructive view about what we might be able to do here.
Do you believe agriculture should be covered in the emissions trading scheme?
Well, that's actually part of the agreement we signed with New Zealand First.
Do you believe there's been a change in public appetite over the last, say, 5 years when it comes to capital gains tax?
Look, I think people's views on capital gains tax move around a little bit. They move around a lot on the basis of what question you might ask people. If you ask people questions in isolation about a tax, you don't necessarily get the answer that would be the full picture that they give. Obviously, issues like the housing market have a role to play with the particular time it's there. So the period of time we've got now is a great one for New Zealanders to engage on the question of what sort of tax system do they want.
The other thing also that I've found, and certainly some of the multinational tax measures were put in place, is New Zealanders have an inherent sense of fairness. And if they feel that something is unfair, then in a way they look to the government to remedy that.
Do they, if the government comes for their family batches, do they feel like that's fair?
Well, again, it's this is something that has to be considered. There's absolutely no doubt about that. But I'll go back to the point where we did ask about the fairness and the balance and the structure. I think the working group has come up with a report that does address those. It's now up to Minister Robinson and myself to take a proposal to Cabinet and for Cabinet to make a decision.
I know it's still sort of early days with this, but your initial thoughts, what are you thinking in terms of whether this be applied to all assets, you know, excluding family home, or whether take a more staged approach and just apply capital gains tax to one asset group and then extend it to another asset group and so on and so on?
Yeah, look, these are the issues that we've got to work through. The working group itself has been clear that it is they're not providing a straitjacket, they're providing a series of options that can be picked up and packages that can be put together. Those are the issues we have to now work through.
And one thing, I'd also like to reiterate that the working group did recommend that any capital gains tax does not apply to personal items like your car, your boat, your jewellery or art or things like that.
The group is divided on the issue of productivity, with capital gains taxes maybe being a hindrance or help to productivity. What's your own personal views on capital gains tax and productivity?
Well, New Zealand's obviously had challenges around productivity for a very long time in the absence of one, so that would be the first comment that I'd make. You can look overseas to international examples where countries who have capital gains regimes have very good rates of productivity. The group's made some comments about that. We'll work our way through those.
And on the issue of fiscal neutrality, if you adopt the capital gains tax and a few other taxes and then offset those with an income tax bracket change, then you have some form of fiscal neutrality, but then you also perhaps neuter the opportunity of having fiscal neutrality over the long term, going out to 2030 when the tax base erodes and costs go up. How do you yourselves perceive fiscal neutrality in the basis of this package?
Yeah, I mean, that's as we decide where we go with this, that's one of the issues we have to work through. I mean, there's some fairly obvious issues. The revenue that's generated by the proposal that the group makes doesn't start to come in to a certain point. So if you're going to offset that in other areas of the tax system, you've got to work out how you put those two things together. So that is very much the process. Nothing happens in isolation in government. We accept that. It's one of the reasons why we have to take some time now to look at, if we make certain decisions about a tax package, what does that mean in other parts, not only in terms of spending, but interaction with welfare and those sorts of issues.
Dr. Collins said that...
Yes, Jason. You've had 3 goes. We'll let you go.
Dr. Collins briefly talked about the timeline of this and said that if the government wanted to have something in place by before the next election, it would be quite a tight time constraint. He expected more resources would have to be poured into that, and that would include bringing in overseas experts. Do you share this position with him?
Yeah, I've seen that comment. Look, as Minister Nash said just before, we've got a lot of confidence in the Inland Revenue Department. We've got high quality officials in there. It is absolutely true there's a lot of work to do here, and clearly we'll look at the resources IRD needs in order to make sure they can do the work.
So you're expecting to bolster their balance sheet a little bit?
Well, I haven't really got to that point yet, and Minister Nash will always want me to bolster the balance sheet of IRD.
But we also need to understand what we're going to recommend in the first place before we make decisions around resourcing with regard to IRD and expertise.
So will that be part of the government's official response in April, how much more money that you're going to give the tax department?
Well, the bottom line is when we make recommendations to the Cabinet and if they accept those recommendations, then we will look at Inland Revenue's capacity to implement what we require, and I suspect decisions will be made at that point in time.
One of the points that the report makes is with the introduction of a capital gains tax, rents will rise. Are you just hurting renters even more?
I think I've read the report pretty thoroughly in that regard, and there is some modelling that suggests there may be some impacts on rents. There's also the lived experience of other jurisdictions where it didn't necessarily have that effect. That's one of the issues that we'll have to look at and assess as we go, but I wouldn't say there's any cut and dry view on that.
One of the recommendations, or kind of sub-recommendations, involved raising the secondary income tax, kind of to compensate if you took away the lowest margin. But Cullen kind of cautioned that he was probably going outside of his remit by recommending that because he specifically said not to raise income taxes. Can you just rule that one out now?
We've ruled out increases in income tax as a result of this this work.
When you consider this in conjunction with the welfare working group?
We have to, in the context of the fact of, as I was answering the question before, whenever you make changes to the tax system, it has an impact on the welfare system because the two things interact together. From a broader government point of view, yes, obviously we'll be thinking about how they work together, but most especially in this immediate period where decisions that we make will affect the opposite system, either the welfare system affecting the tax or the tax affecting welfare. We're certainly looking at that.
Do you see it as a big, hairy-chested report?
I see it as a report that's done the job that we asked of it, which was to come up with a series of packages. And I think most New Zealanders, when they read this, will see that the group's fulfilled that mandate, that yes, they've given some recommendations about what you could do to expand around capital income, but they've also given recommendations about what that might mean for cuts to personal taxes. That sounds to me like exactly the job that we asked of them. I'm not 100% sure what a hairy-chested package would look like.
Do you find it at all ironic that one of the first tax legislation pieces that you passed coming into government was to get rid of a personal tax cut of around $520 a week, and now you may be passing a legislation which gives people a personal income tax cut of maybe around $520
I'm extremely proud of the legislation that we passed because it was what was needed at that point, and I think New Zealanders endorsed that in the election. Just to repeat, one of the main things that we set this group up to do, in addition to fairness, was about balance in the tax system. So if you are going to make decisions like personal income tax cuts, you need to think about balance within the system, about where the money for that might come from.
And could I also say the second piece of legislation we passed was ensuring that multinationals paid their fair share.
On that, in the press release, you've seen about half the entire press release discussing other things that the government's doing outside of a tax working group. Michael Cullen himself described it as a slightly muddy press release. Why was that? Why include all these other things you're doing?
I think Minister Nash is very proud of his work program as the Revenue Minister, and I think it is also important to recognise that while this report's significant, there are other things going on, including both the legislation Minister Nash mentions that was passed last year around base erosion and profit shifting, and the announcement we made on Monday about the discussion document on a digital services tax. Mr Nash has a very busy work program.
The other thing I would say is, when we talk about fairness and balance as one of the mandates for this group, the work program is also about bringing fairness and balance to the tax system in a whole lot of other areas, around multinational taxing, for example.
Do you think it's important to protect Kiwi savers in this process?
What I'd say is that the package that the working groups come up with around KiwiSaver, in fact, would make Kiwi savers better off. And so this is the party, the Labour Party, that introduced KiwiSaver. We're very proud of it. We think it's a very important aspect of New Zealanders' long-term security, and we're obviously going to continue to protect it.
One of the recommendations is congestion charging, and Sir Michael said that that would have been a better move than the regional fuel tax. What do you think?
Well, no, we've done the regional fuel tax, and I certainly support that. The work on congestion charging in New Zealand was started by someone named Simon Bridges, and it's actually a very interesting piece of work in terms, particularly of the city of Auckland, where obviously you have significant issues around congestion. Work is ongoing on that, but I'd say that's some time off from being able to be implemented.
So Aucklanders could have the regional fuel tax and a congestion charge?
Yeah, well, that would be the question you'd ask, isn't it? So we're not anywhere near the question of implementing a congestion charge. I'm just telling you that the work that was started on that was done by Simon Bridges.
If you were to introduce a congestion charge, would you scrap the regional fuel tax?
We're not proposing to introduce a congestion charge at this time, and if we ever did, we would look at the balance of taxation that New Zealanders face and make decisions at that point. But we're not at this point anywhere near that.
And I don't think it's recommended. I think it's recommended that we look at it, as opposed to recommending it out.
Everything in the report is recommended that you look at it.
Some things are more specific than others.
You both wrote to the working group asking specifically to consider a tax-free threshold for small businesses on capital gains. Sir Michael said today, not a good idea, that would introduce distortions and so on. Is that the end of that idea?
Look, like all of the recommendations, both positive and negative, we'll take a look at it and see where that sits for us, but we haven't made any calls on that.
Which parts of the report surprised you the most?
No, I'm not sure that any of it particularly surprised me. I think one of the really important things that I saw in the report is which people in New Zealand would be impacted by a regime on capital gains and capital income, which clearly are those in the highest decile, dramatically so. That's something that I think is worth pondering on when we talk about questions of fairness and balance.
Stuart Nash, do you have an answer for that?
You know, one of the stats is that 20% of New Zealanders own 84% of the assets. And, you know, when we are talking about fairness and balance in the tax system, I think we're beholden to the whole country to look at this and work in a way that does, you know, that works for everyone.
When you look at the timing of how everything interacts to become revenue neutral, a lot of the capital gains income won't come through. Will you still offer those tax cuts really early on if you don't have the money from way out here?
We'll always make sure everything balances up in the books. But that's precisely one of the questions that we've got to work through, because if we did decide to go down that kind of regime, we would then have to work out the flow of income. Clearly it's possible for the government to make additional decisions as well, but as you're pointing out, they have revenue impacts, and the Minister of Finance always makes sure that the books balance up.
Politically, you're going to offer up a tax cut anyway.
You're just getting a long way ahead of yourself.
So Michael was suggesting that you would be influenced by the ballot box.
Well, that's Michael's view. We're influenced by what's the best thing for New Zealand and the best outcome for a fair and balanced tax decision. Folks, I'm going to have to
Minister, the statisticians tell us today that labour productivity has declined for the second year in a row from Slovakian levels, and given that part of the explanation of that has to be the capital shallowness of our business sector, why would you even contemplate taxing the returns to business investment harder than they already are?
I did really answer this question before. New Zealand has struggled with labour productivity in the absence of this. Other countries that have these kinds of regimes have high levels of labour productivity. So I'm not going to make that correlation. We're very committed to making sure that we help improve access to capital for businesses, but all of that will be worked through. Sorry folks, I do have to go.